I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I have been a fan of Justin Torres's for I think we met in like 2011 or something. It was a very long time ago. It was
Maybe
before
2010.
We the Animals had come out officially, and I am wild for this tiny little book with the three brothers and that beautiful, beautiful first person plural narration. And you are back. You are so back with a beautiful, gorgeous, amazing, complicated, wild, gorgeous thing called Blackouts. But as I was saying to you before we hit record, I had a moment when I started reading Blackouts, and I've read it twice now because your editor sent me a manuscript a really long time ago. And then I was reading it, prepping for the show, and I had a moment early on as we're just walking into the palace. We're with our unnamed narrator. We haven't quite met Juan yet, but we know he exists, and he's not in a good space. And I thought, it felt like this sort of 1950s, a little bit, like a little bit of that Michael Cunningham opening to the hours, a little bit John Fonte. And I may have layered in the Fonte because I know you live in Los Angeles these days, but I really felt like we had stepped back in time. And then, of course, like I think it's very early on. There are a couple of time markers where you're like, oh, I'm actually in the 90s at least.
Yeah.
And I love what you do with time. I love what you do with language. I also know that this was maybe not the first start to your second novel. There was that story of the laptop pre-cloud. But I want to talk about the language, and I want to talk about the opening of Blackouts before we go too deep into things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm really glad you had that response. I want it to feel like a bit of a time machine because it's taking, like the opening is taking you somewhere that is kind of outside of time, right? Like the palace is just this place in the desert. I wanted it to feel like stepping off the world. Like the narrator is just like leaving life and stepping off the world and going and actually trying to visit the past. And so the fact that it feels like that, like I love that. I think especially the very opening pages are like very much mirroring Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo. And again, it's about this journey, and you're like, is this a real journey? Is this like what's happening here? Yeah, I wanted to invoke this kind of this sense of we're going somewhere where time functions differently, and not to have the kind of hyper contemporary sense of the 90s.
Yeah, I needed to sort of step away and be much like you did with We the Animals, which did have a contemporary setting, and I was very aware of it. Although there were a couple of old reviews that were like, well, there are no cell phones and there's no internet, so it must be like 1949. And I'm like, no, this is what poverty looks like in America. Thank you very much. Dude, you don't have the internet when you can't buy food.
Who had a computer in the 90s?
I just like and I say this as a person who walks around with two phones because I like to keep things separate, but sometimes the world is just the world. And I love having a nameless narrator. I really like this kid. He is very complicated. And I really like Juan. And they're sort of the anchors, right? Like let's call them the anchors. I mean, you obviously introduced many, many other people, but
yeah. It is largely a dialogue between
it really is. And you use this device of having our narrator tell Juan the story that he's kind of looking to hear, but kind of not, by pretending he's narrating a film. And the book is illustrated.
Yeah.
And it's this sort of 3D kind of sensory explosion, as it were. I mean, I love this. I love everything about this book, but it's not necessarily what people might expect after reading We the Animals, right?
Yeah. I mean, for sure, that was the most important thing to me, was to do something really, really different. I loved what happened with the animals. I got so lucky, and it really like it's still taught in schools. I still get people coming up to me, and it's wonderful. It's a very important book to a lot of people. It's hugely important to me, obviously. I love that. But for myself, I was like, I don't want to write anything similar. I want to really push and stretch and experiment and really do something incredibly different. And it took me a really long time to figure out what that was going be. I think that the visual elements and the kind of textual stuff and these blackout erasure poems that are, the kind of photocopies that are throughout the book, all of that stuff. I don't know, it felt like I was doing so much research for this book. I was just like coming across all this ephemera and all this random stuff, and I was struck by how like two things would be side by side that didn't seem to relate to each other in an archive. And I wanted to have this kind of experience of juxtaposing all this stuff and
Right.
creating a puzzle and a bit more of a challenge, I think, for the reader than We the Animals. That was something that I wanted to do. I was nervous. The word challenge, it's like it's loaded. Sometimes people don't want to be challenged in that way, but I don't know. It seemed like I was going to if I was gonna write another book, which I wasn't sure I wanted to, but if I was gonna do it, it really had to be something different in order for myself. You know what I mean? For like my own kind of artistic growth.
I do want to drop a note that we're taping this after you've been longlisted for the National Book Award for fiction for Blackouts. And we don't yet have the short list, and I am not jinxing anything, so I am moving along very, very quickly, very, very quickly. But I do want to toss that out there because there might have been some yelling in the office when I saw the long list. I was quite pleased. It's a very
I
nice.
was shocked, and
Okay, you can be shocked. I was just pleasantly surprised in many, many ways. But you've talked about this in the past where you didn't know necessarily that you were writing a novel when you sat down to write We the Animals. And this is a period in your life where things are a little messy and you're doing lots of different things. And I think there was a stint dog walking, which I did not know until recently.
yeah, dog walking.
Okay, so there was a lot happening.
Yeah.
You had dropped out of college though.
Mhm.
You end up going to Iowa. You end up getting a Stegner Fellowship. You are now an assistant professor, excuse me. I know.
Associate. I just got tenure.
Associate? Okay, great. Thank you. Congratulations on tenure. But you're a professor now.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily the trajectory you would have seen for yourself when you sat down to scribble.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't know you were writing a novel, and having read We the Animals more than once, that blows my mind every time I think about it. And now we have Blackouts, and the way the two sit on this continuum.
Yeah.
There is one piece of overlap that I am going to sort of bring up. There's a character, our nameless narrator.
Yeah.
He and Juan do meet when they're both institutionalized.
Yeah.
And there's a tiny, if you've read We the Animals, you know what I'm referring to.
Absolutely.
If you haven't, I'm not spoiling anything for you, I promise. Just go back and enjoy it anyway. But was that something that was going to happen sort of as you were because you're very particular about how you write.
Yeah.
And I have a hard time believing you didn't know that that was going to be there somewhere in this new book.
Yeah, you know what? I think that what happened was kind of like to go back to the trajectory, that you're laying out. My whole world was spun around by We the Animals. I was really struggling in a lot of ways, and just like also just a mess in my 20s, like living.
It's okay. We're allowed to be messy in our 20s. Like, I just want to be really super clear about that.
Exactly. Like it's not an unusual path.
No.
But I did. But the idea that I would be a novelist and then go on to like go to Iowa and Stegner, like fellowship at Harvard or whatever. I mean, it was so outside of any kind of thing that I imagined for myself. And when it started to happen, the next book that I was writing was about somebody who was a mess in their 20s and doing a lot of sex work, and that's the manuscript that got lost. I mean, there are vestigial bits of it in here because that's what I had like in an email somewhere. It was like before the cloud existed, or at least before I knew about the cloud. Yeah, you're absolutely right in that the kind of seed for a lot of Blackouts is like this person who's in their 20s who's kind of wandering through their own life and struggling in a lot of ways and dealing with precarity, all kinds of precarity, and that person coming into contact again with somebody he met in the mental hospital when he was a teenager. And so that, I think you can see a relationship between the young boy and We the Animals and who's like, it ends when he's a teenager, and then the a young unnamed narrator in Blackouts. Absolutely. I think there's a continuum there. It's like a persona. It's obviously very much similar, a lot of overlap with my own life. I've talked about that a million times.
Yeah, I just want to be clear that we're not talking about autofiction here. Like, it is
Yes.
possible
Yeah.
to set some framework maybe, or like to use a bad house building metaphor, like you set the studs, right? And
Yeah.
you do the framing and then you move on and do whatever. But I just there's always this kind of presumption, and it seems to happen obviously, well, I think more with writers of color than
Mm.
some. And just this assumption, especially if there's complications,
Yeah.
life complications in the story, where it's like, oh, well, that's you. And it's like, well, actually, I make things up for a living. This is what I do. I fake it.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. And it's strange, this idea that everybody's not doing that, right? Everybody's doing it to some degree. They're
Yeah.
just taking from what you live, you have experiences, and then
Hmm.
you turn them into fiction. That's how the whole process works.
Right.
But yeah, I think that this book in particular is also about somebody who's like trying to get outside of themselves, right?
Yeah.
So whereas with the animals, it's very almost claustrophobic, right?
Hmm.
Because
Yeah. Yeah.
it's about a kid in a very intense family, and everything happens at home, and it's this book. It's like he wants to know about the world. He wants to know about the past. He goes out in search of Juan because Juan is he's representational to him of this connection to a lost past or a suppressed history or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, you and I have both been around for more than a minute, and one of the things that I think sometimes it's hard to put into context is, certainly we're missing a generation of men and women because of the AIDS crisis. Like, we're literally missing a generation of artists and musicians and dancers and bankers and lawyers and doctors and all, like,
Yeah.
it was catastrophic.
Yeah.
And so the idea that you've got this kid, right, who's leading his very messy life, who's turned to an elder.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. Like, I have friends, who were part of ACT UP in the early days and whatnot, and it's wild to hear some of those stories,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But there
Yeah.
aren't a lot of people left.
Yeah, and I think that in queer lineages, like there's not this natural, like you have to seek out elder, right? Like you have to seek out this connection to other generations. It's quite possible to get cloistered with like you're in a bar with like 20 people who are within 5 years of you, and you have to make like an active investment in knowing both the people of the generations that have come before and knowing about yes that missing generation. I mean that was enormous to me when I was growing up. I felt like I was like born in 1980, like I came into the world at the same exact moment as AIDS came on the map. I think that everybody just above me, right, was so absolutely decimated by this. And of course, they didn't want to talk about it. It was all like, like as soon as the drugs came that started turning things around radically, people were ready to kind of move on in a big way. And it was so painful. And then of course there's all this missing, there's just missing artifacts, right? There's missing culture, there's missing books and paintings and everything that you're saying, right? Like it's just not it's not there. And so I've always been really interested in kind of how things get passed down. What are kind of what is the idea of queer inheritance, right? Yeah.
And you're doing it in so many ways in this
Mhm.
book. So many ways. And then I got to the index as well at the back. I mean, do we technically call it a bibliography? What do we call that?
Yeah, I mean, I called it like blinkered endnotes because it's from the perspective of the
Yeah,
character.
it's really fun to read, but also I think there's more actual fact in
Yes.
that section than some might suspect. And there are a couple of phrases I want to poke you on because I know they're part of the research you did, but they kind of made me a little itchy every
Mm,
time I hit them. And one was variance, where it
mm.
made me bananas every time I saw it in the text. And we're going to come back to what you were referring to. And also Puerto Rican syndrome.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Dude,
I
dude,
know,
I,
that's
I
wild.
and I know you found them in the but we need to language matters, right? Language
Yeah,
matters. And yes,
yeah,
we have stepped outside of sort of what we know as you said, you wanted us to step off the planet, right? But
Yeah. 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 I mean, those terms are real medical terms and real medical journals. I mean, it's shocking that in the DSM-4, this diagnostic and statistical manual that all of the kind of psychiatrists in America refer to, that there was this diagnosis called Puerto Rican syndrome, which is just, I mean, the idea of a culturally bound syndrome, it's a strange idea, right? And it's very similar to like the idea of hysteria, right? This affliction that affects only certain kinds of people. It was also fascinating to see that the terms don't come from nowhere, right? That like there's a reference to something that's going on. And I think that, it's first discovered in the military, even though the people who are talking about it are not talking about the circumstances in which Puerto Ricans are sent off to combat, right? They're not talking about the rampant racism that they're encountering every day in that very institution. And so it's like there's such blindness, right? All that can be seen is that these Puerto Ricans are having this kind of reaction to stress. And we're going to call it Puerto Rican syndrome, right? Rather than anything else, right? And I think that the same thing with the term variance, that was the more polite term than deviance, right? I mean,
yeah.
it
Oh,
was like
great. The
more
bar is really
often.
low, Justin. The bar is really low when we're saying, well, variance
Yeah.
is less offensive than deviance. But I mean, we were barbarians. We didn't have the language. And yet, I mean, in the 20s and 30s, there was a queer culture.
Yeah,
There was a
yeah,
lot of drag. There was a lot of just sort of
yeah.
like, why are we pretending that suddenly all of these things were invented in like 1995? Like,
Yeah.
that's just not the case.
I know. I know. I mean, I think that again, I think that this is part of ruptures, right?
Okay.
And a lack of a sense of continuity in
Okay.
history. I think that there's a kind of forever present, or there can be, right? That this sense of everything is new and invented for the first time. And if you actually look at what people were getting up to in at the turn of the century, in the tens and twenties and thirties, like they had really kind of radically queer ideas of how to organize themselves, their relationship to the world, their relationship to others, and they don't. They're kind of taxonomies of queerness, right? Like the way that they identify don't really map, onto the way that we identify nowadays. And so there's a lot but also it's fascinating. Like it's absolutely fascinating, and a lot of it gets lost. I think you're absolutely right that there's this kind of presentism that happens where we're just like,
I mean, you've written a book about a book, right? Blackouts is a book about a book and lost history and who
mm,
gets to tell history. I
mm,
mean, it's Juan and our unnamed narrator are certainly the heart of the book. I mean, they're the structure, they're the heart, they are. But there is also this sort of secondary story
mm.
about Jan Gay
Yeah, yeah,
and this
yeah,
book and the credit that she does not receive for the work she does. And of course, I'm thinking back to sort of Kinsey and all of that
yeah,
work that came. So, can we talk about the
yeah,
idea behind using that book as a device?
yeah, yeah. So when that book came into my life, it was
Mhm.
just this strange, it's just called Sex Variants: A Study in Homosexual Patterns, and I was just like, what is this?
And when was it originally published?
It was published in 1941, and it's about
Okay.
a study that took place in the 1930s. So the study kind of goes through the 30s, and they finally published it in 1941. And I was just like completely taken by the case studies because somebody took a lot of care in transcribing these case studies. Somebody was like, because there's so much pathology in that book, right? Like there's so much language that is just like demonizing and stigmatizing these people. It's medical language, but there's also like real care in getting down the vernacular, the different ways that people talked about their experience, like the kind of vocabulary they use. And I was just like, who did this? Like where? And so then I started researching. There was not a lot that I could find out about the origins of the study, but there were a couple books which I reference in the
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
notes of the book, that were super helpful. And that's where I learned about Jan Gay. And I learned that, oh, this was actually her idea. She was a lesbian, she was an activist. She had the idea of on her own, she had interviewed all of these women in various cities who, all these lesbians, and she had taken down their case histories, and she was going off of Magnus Hirschfeld's model, which is the kind of Berlin free thinking kind of. And so she brought this study to somebody, and they were like, "This is a great idea, and now we're going to take all your research, take all of your context, have you recruit people to come in and participate in the study, have you take down their testimonies." And then at some point in the study, they just took it all away from her. They basically erased her from the study entirely. She was furious with the end result. She was really, really angry with how pathological they made these, and and she'd invited a lot of these people to participate herself, and some of them were like artists and very successful and very confident, and they were asked to recount things that in ways that felt dehumanizing to them. They were like photographed, their genitals measured. I mean, it was a lot. It was a lot of this kind of, yeah, like very much inflected by the kind of eugenicist thinking of the time as well. And so when I learned that story, I was like, I want to, but I didn't want to write historical fiction. I was like, I want to talk about Jan Gay. I want to put her in here, but I don't want to write historical fiction. And so how do I get at that in some other way?
Which you do. I just want to be clear, you do. I love the way the images just pop up, and some feel very, very immediate, and some I kind of had to go back and think about again.
Mhm.
And others I was kind of like, all right, okay, I see where you're going with this. There's the blackout poetry, certainly, and whatnot, but obviously you're working on the text before images are being added. But this device that I mentioned at the top of the show, this idea that our narrator is telling the story to Juan
Mhm.
by narrating a film.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's a great device. It
yeah,
is a really good device. It makes perfect sense for this kid,
yeah,
right? Like,
yeah,
it makes
yeah.
total sense for this kid. But when did you sort of commit to that idea? Because I wasn't expecting that from you. I was
Yeah.
thinking, "Oh, there would be lots of literary references and maybe some poetry." And it works. It
Yeah,
works so
yeah,
beautifully, but I
yeah.
wasn't expecting it. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's just I just take that from Puig, from Manuel Puig, from Kiss of the Spider Woman. It's like one of the most influential books that like I've ever read. I love, love, love that book. And it's two men in a jail cell in Argentina, and one of them is there because he's queer, and the other's there because he's like a revolutionary, and they just talk. And Molina, the queer one, tells these film plots, but he's kind of just making them up as well. It's kind of a hodgepodge, and I just love that book. And so when I had the two of them in a room together,
mhm.
and um, I realized like, oh my god, like I've written this book where there are these two people, with
Yeah,
very different life experiences, and they're trying to teach each other something. Especially one is trying to tell the narrator and kind of draw him into this a sense of the past and a
yeah,
sense
yeah,
of history. And it's like, well, how are they going to do it if they're just like lying in the dark
yeah.
together? And I had written a short story a long time ago in which two lovers narrate because
Mhm.
they're living somewhere without electricity, and they narrate to each other in the dark, and that was like part of the vestigial stuff that makes
Yeah,
its
yeah,
way to Blackout.
yeah, yeah.
And then I was like, oh, that's Puig. And then I was like, oh, and then it just kind of started happening. I think also I had recently read this book by Jaime Manrique, which was called Eminent Mary Collins, which is about his experience meeting Puig, who is himself this figure in his life that, what I mean, that is like this literary figure that, and I don't know, I was really interested in that kind of exchange, right? And like not, I didn't want to be too didactic, but I wanted somebody I wanted to kind of Socratic dialogue, right? Like I wanted somebody old and wise to be talking. And it's like, how do you make that dynamic? How do you make that come alive? And I landed on this kind of this device of movie plots.
legacy though, right? Like, we were talking about this missing generation, we're talking about how you get erased from the work that you've done, right? Like, Jan Gay, she gets taken out of this project that she created, and it's handed over to a couple of dudes who are not as careful, certainly as she would have been. But this idea of legacy, right? Like Juan and his legacy, what does it mean? What is this kid actually pulling from him? And in a way, we're talking about found family,
Yeah.
right? Like we're talking about found family with Jan and her wife and their connections to other people. Like it just, what
Yeah.
works, what doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't think this is a spoiler, but in the very beginning of the book, when they're in the mental hospital, there's a flashback to when, like, that's how the book opens, that the narrator is just a teenager and he's been institutionalized, and Juan kind of comes and sits next to him and just watches over him and looks over him. And I think that there's something that happens when there's a kind of intimacy that can happen. They didn't know each other very long. They weren't, they were in the same place for like 2 weeks, but there's when you're trapped, when you're basically imprisoned and the hours just stretch and stretch and stretch and you're under such pressure, there's an intimacy that can happen at a kind of super accelerated pace. And that's what happens. And they become family in that moment, right? There's something that they recognize in one another. And the narrators, like whatever, half Puerto Rican. Juan was born in Puerto Rico. Like there there's that kind of tribal connection that they have, but also it's a recognition of queerness. But also just like sensibility, like a recognition of a certain kind of, I don't know, like literary tenderness that like can lapse over into depression very easily. I think that like there's a lot that they share in that moment that bonds them, that makes them, yeah, kind of chosen family. And that's why in this moment of crisis, the narrator seeks out Juan.
It's also that difference between loneliness and being alone, right?
Mhm.
And like when you find someone, even if it is that accelerated connection, right, that happens under, extreme circumstances kind of thing. It's so clear that our narrator just is looking, it's not just solace, it's not comfort, it's just he's looking for home ultimately, I think.
Yeah,
And knows that the only way he's going to find it is if he makes it himself.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, you
yeah,
can't really rely, Juan's story kind of makes it clear that you can't necessarily rely on the other people who
yeah.
may or may not continue to show, like, you just have to make a thing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking so much about what you just said about loneliness and being alone, and I
Yeah.
I I love that, and I think that one of the things that Juan is doing, like this book is a lot about nothingness. It's a lot about nothingness and blacking out and erasure as something, that can be quite terrifying, but also that could be a protective gesture, right? Sometimes when we like lose time, stop recording memories or whatever, it's because what's happening is too much, right? Brain's just like, no, I'm not gonna remember this, right? It's just like, no way. And sometimes, like, with the blackout poems, it can be a kind of way of trying to get rid of that pathological language, get rid of that overlay, right? Like, there's other ways in which the nothingness, the emptiness,
Mhm.
those gaps can be embraced. They're not just necessarily ruptures in a negative sense. And as far as loneliness goes, I think that one is somebody who can very much be alone, right? I mean, he's just in this room, like getting ready to die by himself with books. Like he's just reading, and it's enough, right? The companionship he needs, he finds in a kind of literary way. And I think the one of the things he's teaching the narrator is not to be so terrified of his loneliness or his aloneness, right? Not to right to to kind of it's like I do yoga, and like the goal is always like to get towards nothingness. Like that's what you're doing. That's the end product of like a lot of Buddhist thought, right? Like it's like nothingness as something to aspire to, right? To be comfortable with that nothingness. And so yeah, I think it is a lot about loneliness and our aversion to kind of that the void, and yeah, and how do we get comfortable with that?
There's another piece of the story too, though, which is shame.
Mm,
And we still, as a culture, right, we have this thing about shame
Yeah.
and who shame gets applied to
Yeah.
versus you know what I'm talking about. Or let's say the applications of shame, right? And the idea that, okay, occasionally I joke about shame as a tool, like, please get off your cell phone in a small enclosed space. Like, I really do not need to hear you yelling on your phone. Like, what is wrong with you? May we never ever have, the ability to make phone calls on a flight. Please, please, please never let that happen.
No.
But shame is something obviously that gets transmitted in lots of different ways, and it certainly appears throughout the original sex variant. I mean, you've hinted at it.
I was thinking a lot about the difference between shame and stigma as well when I was writing this. So there's this in the back of the book, like an alternative epigraph, which is from Irving Goffman, which is all about stigma, right? And it's about how, I mean, stigma is like shame is one of those things that you feel, right? Like somebody shames you and you feel ashamed inside of you, right? Like it's like, and sometimes we can feel shame about things. It's like anybody else would be like, why are you ashamed of that? Like it's not like don't worry about it. And you're like laying about it at night, anxious. You can't stop thinking about some stupid thing you said at a party, you know? And it's like there's that kind of shame. And then there's like stigma, which is just like you were born into this world with like this body, this sexuality, this right? And it's just like you are part of a stigmatized group. And that is something that you can't you can't rectify it within yourself, right? It's something that has been placed upon you. And I think that one of the things that the book is interested in and that Juan is trying to encourage the narrator to do is to be like interested in stigma, right? Like, where does it come from? Like, what, right? Like, what were people saying about queers in the 1930s? What were people saying about Puerto Ricans in the 1950s? What, like where's the kind of institutional, official rhetoric coming from that produces this stigma, right?
Juan strikes me as a really puckish kind of character. And I realize we're talking about a man who's dying.
Mm.
And yet just sort of the way he needles our narrator in that way that your, like, grandparents do, right? Like, "Oh, you think you know everything? Oh, you really think you know everything," right? Like,
Yeah,
or you look at your parents and you're like, "Oh, right, you were people before you
yeah,
had children." Like, how do I process that? I don't wanna process
yeah,
it. I do not wanna know. Thank you. I do not wanna
yeah.
know anything. But there is sort of this puckish sensibility to him that I
Mhm.
really appreciate, and
Yeah,
he's just sort of gently and very lovingly trying to get our narrator to maybe open his eyes a little bit
yeah.
and be
And
like,
to
"Oh,
laugh at himself. And to
yeah,"
laugh
and
at himself,
I
yeah.
mean, kid's not there yet, but he's getting there. There's so many pieces that you pull into this story too. There's the children's book, there's
Mhm.
which I'm sorry, the drunken animals, it's very funny. There's a lot of charm in this book.
Yeah.
There's a
They
lot of charm. There's a lot of sort of love and charm and heart and all of the things that you hope to have, but you're doing a balancing act, right? Which is obviously, as the writer, it's your job. I get that.
yeah.
But I also
Yeah.
know that you're picky about sentences. I know that I've known this for years that it's
Yeah.
not rewriting for you. Like you really will sit there and stare at a
Yeah.
blank page until you get the
Absolutely.
thing that you want.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a really slow way
Mhm.
to move forward. And I think that one of the reasons that this book is so dialogue heavy is because I think that because I like work so slowly sentence by sentence, I can kind of get trapped in a self-seriousness as I'm composing, right? Because it's like it's not free enough, it's not loose enough. And so the dialogue, it was really helpful to have Juan, who is able to tease, who really laughs at himself and really pokes at the narrator and tries to get him out of this kind of self-seriousness. Even though Juan also wants to teach him things about the world, he also wants to teach him how to be in the world a little bit. Right? Like how to like not think about himself quite so much and think about others a little bit more and all of that stuff. And it was really freeing for me on a sentence level because dialogue, there's a kind of call and response, right? There's like it really pulls you to the next sentence, and I obsess so much on each sentence unit that to have these tiny little units going quickly was like freeing for me. It was like stepping on the gas a little bit. Yeah, I think those two things are related.
When did you start this version of novel number 2, as I refer to, because, obviously there was that last one that was lost, but I don't know how far along you were in that, and it sounds like that entire thing, you just literally let it go, you lost the thing, you let it go and started. So when did
Yeah.
you start physically writing this one?
This sex variants book came into my life right before We the Animals came out. So I was working at a used bookstore, like a new and used bookstore in San Francisco that doesn't exist anymore. And somebody dropped off this box of books. And so I knew that I wanted to write about it since like 2010, basically. And I would just they're huge books, and I would carry them around with me everywhere. And I would but I didn't know how or why. And I just didn't honestly have the stability in my life to like do the research, et cetera, right? So, but I always knew that it was something I wanted to write about. So they're kind of like parallel tracks, right? And then I had the kind of more immediate stuff that were these kind of stories about a sex worker that I was writing more quickly, and they were kind of more in line with what We the Animals was. Uh, and but I was trying to change the way that I write because I was just like, I don't want to, I just, it's
You
like,
don't need to be that guy who keeps coming back.
yeah,
I do. The first person plural, I love that voice. I also love a really close second, like that when you is deployed well.
yeah,
Oh man,
me
like
too.
How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, that Mohsin Hamid. There is a lot of really fantastic writing, but you don't need to be the guy who writes every novel the same way.
Yes, exactly. When I lost this manuscript, it was, in a way, it was freeing. I lose everything all the time anyway, so like I've become very good at just being like, well, that's gone forever. But also, I was like, okay, I can kind of merge these projects. And I would say I was writing this for a very long time, but not in a very focused way. I was, like I was learning how to be a teacher, a professor. I mean, I
Yeah.
was just living life. Like I had jumped class in this dramatic way, and I was just like feeling whiplash. I was like, what? Like what is life? Who am I? And so it was really COVID that allowed me to sit down and be like, okay, I'm finishing this. And this is it. Like this is the time I'm gonna get it done. And so a lot of the pieces and fragments that were floating around get pulled together and stitched together during COVID. Yeah.
2023 has been a pretty good year for books, but it's been particularly good for me because I get a new novel from you and a new novel from Ayana Mathis.
Yeah.
And both of you, for your own reasons, you took your time. That's okay. I can be patient. But it's been a really, really good fall. And I didn't know you convinced her to apply to Iowa, that you got into Iowa and you were like, you have to come with me. Um,
Yeah.
and I really love this idea. And I'm just wondering, how much of each other's work do you get to see? And I should have asked her this question too, but we were galloping all over the place too. And I just figured I would catch up with you and get some of the answer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we at that time we were like so close. We were just like super duper close friends. And yeah, and I was like, I'm going to Iowa, you're coming with me. Like and
I really love that.
and she came and applied while
Yeah.
like already living in Iowa City with me. And then of course she like went on to be a faculty member uh, because she's just incredibly talented and incredibly charming and smart, and she's a real deal. And so at that point, we read everything. I mean, we were living
Right.
together.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, like every like sentence by sentence, like we were just like we were just together all the time, always reading
Right.
everything. And then I think after Iowa and after I graduated and after our books came out, it was, like I got this job in LA and I moved to the West Coast. And so now, I mean, love the book, but I read it in galley form. I mean,
Yeah. Okay.
I didn't see it before the galley form. And the same thing, we sent each other galleys as soon as we had them. But I think that, yeah, and I think it's probably like second book stuff. We both took a really long time, like,
All right.
so.
I'm just going to enjoy the idea of the two of you just sitting in a corner somewhere working on stuff together that, I mean, okay, maybe I'm nostalgic for something that doesn't actually, impact my life. But when I think that we got We the Animals and the 12 Tribes of Hattie. I'm
I
pretty happy as a reader.
know. I
And now
know.
we have Blackouts and the Unsettled.
Yeah. And then the Unsettled's so good. Yeah.
Yeah, but you've been teaching for like 10 years, right?
Yeah, at least, but at UCLA, I think 8 years. But I was teaching before that. Yeah, ever since Sweet Animals came out. Yeah.
What's it like being the adult
Yeah.
in the room? And you know why I'm asking you this question. I mean, like, I love the idea that you are where you are and that all of these things happened and you were able to turn them into something
Yeah.
that so many younger people are actually going to be able to benefit like very directly from.
Yeah, it's wild. It's wild. I mean, I have like another kind of persona that I step into. I think like in this format, it's like I'm talking to somebody that I really like that I haven't talked to in a long time. I'm very just myself and loose and whatever. When I teach, I think I'm very much like, all right. Because they're
Yeah.
so young. They're so young.
Oh, babies.
20 years younger than me.
Babies.
And so I do kind of do this authoritative thing. I mean, not
Right.
like in a nasty way, but in
Right.
I step into the role, right? But it is, I always feel like slightly like I'm watching myself, like doing
Yeah.
Professor Drag, you know? It's like that's me, but it's also not really me, you know? But you do it for them, makes them
Right. Right.
please as well, right?
Yeah, I love that idea of you do it for them. What are you teaching now? Like, who are you teaching, I should ask, actually?
Yeah, I mean, luckily I'm on sabbatical at the moment for like do book tour stuff. At UCLA, I teach a lot of creative writing courses, and then I teach also like Latinx literature courses and queer lit courses. I like always teach Gil Cuadros this book, City of God, which I just absolutely love. It's hugely important to me. And he has a new book coming out next year of uncollected writings because he died at like 34 with AIDS. And so I'm really excited about that. I wrote a forward to that. I'm like pushing that. I'm talking about it wherever I can.
Okay.
I think I think it's an important book for the culture. So like in a course like that, I'll teach Manuel Munoz, I'll teach like Angie Cruz, I'll teach if I'm doing something very contemporary, like I taught a classical Latinx now, and I taught this like really Indiana book. Like other sometimes I'm teaching more historical stuff. I'll
Yeah.
teach John Recchi, and I love it. I love coming up with new syllabi
Mhm.
and pushing myself. Like it's a great way to be like, here's a list of books I've been meaning to read, and this is going to force me to engage with them in a really deep way. So
It also sounds to me like you are reading for voice first and
mm,
language comes second. I mean, not in your own work, language comes first, obviously, but that's what it sounds like to just the names you rattled off. I'm like, oh, yeah. Okay.
yeah,
It all starts with voice. Or like even Puig and Kiss of the Spider Woman. I'm like, yeah. Okay. It's
yeah.
voice.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. That's a really good point. I think that, well, especially when I'm thinking about what to teach as well, right? Because you can get students who don't see themselves as readers to really fall in love with literature if voice reaches out and grabs them, right? If something really subtle is happening on a kind of language level, you can get them there, but it can be more difficult to kind of make them fall in love with it. But if the voice is just jumping off the page, then that's usually what makes them think about what's happening on another level as well, you know?
And part of what I'm excited about with Blackouts, beyond the fact that I got a really great read out of it, is all of the young people whose brains are gonna blow up when they read this book. I'm so excited. Like, I mean, listen, our peer group, like, we're ready for this book. We want this, but like, it's gonna fill in some gaps, whatever. But like, oh man, some 20-year-old somewhere, his or her head is going to explode in the
Yeah,
best possible way. Like, here you are on the page in a way that you haven't seen before. It's a really sticky voice, right? Like, even though our narrator doesn't have any really sticky voice, like
yeah,
Juan is kind of the grown-up you want to hang out with, right? Like, if you're
totally.
our narrator, I
Yeah,
totally get why
yeah,
Juan is the person he's gravitated towards without a
yeah,
doubt.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and to be able to face someone as they are actively dying
yeah,
when you're a
yeah,
young person, I mean, that's a trip.
yeah. It's a really strange experience to think about for 200, whatever, 300 pages. For me,
It's not that
to
wait,
const
it's not even 300 pages. What are you talking about? Hold on.
Yeah, no, what is it? I'm trying to look at the final. The
Oh,
final
okay. If
is
you go through the illustration credits, you get to 300 pages, but
exactly.
the
Yeah.
actual writing of the thing is 295.
And a lot of those are pictures. A lot of those are pictures. Yeah. It's a relatively short book.
It is
It's
a
longer than
relatively short
animals.
book, but did you get to read Christina Sharpe's Ordinary Notes, which
I
came out
haven't read
earlier?
it yet. I have
Okay.
it, but I haven't read it
Well, you
yet.
show our publisher. Just stylistically, she does some similar things to what you're doing
Yeah.
with text on the page.
Yeah.
I mean, there's actually one of her notes is, I think, copy from a Post-it. And I
Yeah.
say this with total admiration because I am the queen of Post-it notes. Like I have a giant screen on my desk, a computer screen that I actually don't use. It really just holds Post-it with my taping schedule on it. I live and die by Post-it notes.
I love the idea of using your
Oh,
computer,
it's
like
I
an
because I have
analog
a
pinboard.
very large laptop, so it's not like I need the second screen. Like I'm not one of those people who has to spend all my time with spreadsheets. And obviously, if you
Yeah.
do, you need a second screen. I'm like, no, Post-it note holder, absolute Post-it note. As long as I can see who I'm taping with and what day.
I'm really excited to read that book. I think we have shared an editor as well. I think Jenna edited
I
the book
think you do
as well.
share an
Yeah.
editor.
I haven't read it yet because you know how it is, right?
I
At the end
do.
of a book coming together, it's like the stack is enormous of things that came out right when I was finishing this one.
Yeah. We're lucky that, I mean, I laugh about it all the time because I'm producing sort of 3 hours, sometimes more, of original audio a week. And I'm like, yes, my reading is slightly prescribed in a way it was not previously. But then you slide stuff in and you're like, how quickly can I read this? And luckily for me, I do read, like, I have a superpower. I read very quickly and I can retain, but
Yeah.
sometimes you're just like, how am I going? Okay. Have you read anything lately that you love? Even though you just said, I know all of this came out when I was, but
Yeah, I mean, I can just show. I'm just like thinking of books on my desk. There's songs
love.
which like I'm very late to. Like this is the thing, right? It won the National Book Award.
But it was only last year. It's not like it was 10 years ago.
But I mean, I was been excited about it since what else is on my desk? I'm really excited about this, which is Miss Hildebrandt's
Oh, Touching the Art.
Morris
Okay, that one is
book.
not on my radar.
Um,
Punks is the poetry collection that we were just raving
oh
about.
yeah, sorry.
It just occurred to me. I was like, oh, I should say the title because we're looking at the screen.
This I finished a while ago, but it's still on my desk because I'm still thinking about it. I try to read a lot of stuff in translation. It kind of gets me to new kind of horizons with language and structure. I think that it's really interesting to see like what actually makes it
Yeah.
into the US market, what actually gets translated, because it's got to have done something really incredibly special because it's so hard for those books to even get translated.
Well, what gets translated and how? You know, when you're reading something and you're just like, oh, I think this is not what it was intended to be.
Yeah. Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not saying, I am not claiming to be multilingual in ways where I could,
Yes.
do crazy things on the page. All I'm saying is, I think as a reader, you get to a point where something's off.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so to have a good translation and to have something where you're like, oh, like,
Yeah.
you know that
Yeah.
novel Earthlings, the Sayaka Murata?
No.
All right, I'm gonna
No.
get a copy to Jenna so she can get a copy to
Yeah,
me.
send it to
It's
me, please.
trippy. It is,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's one of those books, and I'm like, I can feel the Japanese-ness of it in a
Yeah.
way that, if someone handed it to me in Japanese, I would be like, "Hi, thanks so much." I got nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think the translation, like, it's a friend of mine does translation work.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Her name is Mariam Ramani, and she translated this book called "In Case of Emergency" by this Iranian writer. That's like it's like super queer, and it's about like an earthquake, and this and this and this person who's like dressing cross gender so that can traverse the city without getting harassed, kind of thing. It's like it's fascinating, amazing book, and I had so many conversations with her about translating culture at the same time that you're translating the actual words and language and meaning and rhythm, right? You also have to translate culture. Like you have to, and that is
So hard.
it's so hard
It's
and
so
so
hard.
complicated. And the more people who are studying translation and doing translation, like the better off our literature is going to be in general,
Mhm.
I think. And so I'm always trying to. I mean, it's funny because like I'm in an English department. I'm not in a conflict department, but I'm always trying to push and recommend. I mean, there's just some people who are amazing translators who are like, I'll read everything that they write if you translate. Yeah.
I also just think our art really should reflect who we
Yeah.
are, and, like, we shouldn't be so provincial. And sometimes it pays off in wonderful ways, and sometimes I'm just like, "Well, I guess I'm not gonna finish that." But, like, so what's the worst thing that happened? I didn't finish a book.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
I'm totally okay with that. Like, it's fine. I don't have to finish every book. But I mean, I read because I wanna see what else is out there. Like,
Yeah.
our narrator, right, who wants to know what else is out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I cannot wait. I'm so excited for Blackouts to be published. I'm
Really?
so excited, and I'm just gonna sit quietly while we wait for the shortlist from the lovely folks at the National Book Award, who also, if you're starting on literature and translation, actually, they've started a prize, and it's a really good
Oh,
way to check out what's happening, like, right now in
yeah.
literature and translation. They've been picking some really interesting, smart stuff.
Totally. I mean, it's so funny because when I saw the long list for the translator, I
Yeah,
went to Instagram and I was like, does anybody want to start a book club where we just
yeah.
read the long list of translated literature with me? Because I was so excited. And I had no anticipation of being shortlisted or being
Yeah, yeah,
longlisted
yeah.
myself. And then that happened. And now I'm like, well, actually, I'm going to read all of the other books on the long list that I haven't read yet because I haven't
Well,
read quite a few of them.
there's
And so,
I'm really hoping I get to see you in New York in November, but
thank
Justin Torres, thank you so much for giving me all this
you.
time and letting me wander all around Blackouts with you, because this book it's really special. It's really special, it's really great, it's exactly the kind of thing we need in this moment, so thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for doing this. It's like so important to have people who are so smart about books talking about books in the culture. So I really appreciate it. I really, yeah, it's been great.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.